It should be noted that in those circumstances where we had 3 town and 1 mafia left, I actually calculated those as if they were 2 and 1 because that is the one time where we can safely assume that you would sleep with 4 players left. We'll talk about other sleep circumstances here in a bit, but just so you know, those calculations were made that way on the original model. One of the first things that we can look at beyond the basic baseline model is what the effect of a bad player has on the game. And I'm not talking about just any bad player, but I'm talking about a perfectly bad player. And what I mean by a perfectly bad player is that they're the person that the moment you see their face, everyone knows that they're town or mafia, and you're 100% confident. And given that we can model that individual, we find out that a bad player actually raises town's ability to win the game by about 4%, 4.2%. So bad players actually are good for town, and we can see why here very quickly. First of all, if they roll town, they literally have no effect on the game. I think it's reasonable to assume that if a player is perfectly bad, that the moment Mafia saw them in the town list, they would kill them in night 0, because if they showed up on day 1, everyone knows that they're town, they would add to no false narrative and serve no purpose. And there's a chance that they might be a power roll, and so they would just automatically be killed. And so it doesn't alter the game at all. So we see that if that bad player rolls town, it stays at 48.4%. If in fact the person rolls mafia, then we realize that they will show up on day 1. Everyone in the game will know that they're mafia and will immediately lynch them. And I suspect y'all could come up with reasons why you'd want to keep a known mafia player around for whatever reason. But in this case, it's easier just to model it. And we find out that if we do get a correct lynch on day 1, town's win percentage goes up to almost 70%. And so since a bad player will more often roll town than mafia, you can see it ends up at 52.6%, the effect of a bad player. But we also know that there's no such thing as a perfectly bad player. There are just players that are not quite as effective as others in terms of maintaining their narrative, whether it be a true town narrative or a false town narrative as mafia. And one of the things a poorer player faces too often, I think, is the day 1 mislynch. And so we can actually calculate, if you look at the right side of our flow chart, that is the day 1 mislynch. And if we just look at that as our entire game, we can calculate that town now wins only 33.6% of the time. So getting lynched on day 1 or mislynched on day 1 reduces the win percentage by 15%. And getting lynched as mafia on day 1 raises the town percentage by over 20%. So you can see that a poorer player has a massive influence on the game. But here's the striking part, and that is what happens if a player gets mislynched on day 2. What does that do to the overall game? Well, calculating this independent of everything else, we find that a day 2 mislynch also reduces the town win percentage by a considerable amount. It's over 10% of the time. And on day 3, it's even worse. So someone who's mislynched on day 3 actually has a larger negative impact on town than someone that gets day 1 mislynched. But I think it's important to understand that any mislynch is a heavy price for town to pay, as is a day 1 lynch for a mafia player. So just to give you an idea of some of the largest effects in the game, that's these lynches, these mislynches, and the effect that they have. One of the next thing we can look at is this idea of not getting a lynch on day 1. So we actually go to sleep either by choice or by the fact that we don't get an RNG or whatever. And so there's an effect that happens on day 1. And in fact, we can model this just by going from day 1 to day 2 without any lynches. And since there are 3 mafia left at this point, no power rolls in the game, they're going to get their 2 kill power and make it an 8-3 game. We can run all the calculations, multiply it by our 7s and 3s, reduce the model down so we can make the calculations, and eventually we get to a number that says that town's win percentage drops considerably. So by going to sleep, you lose 10% of your chance to win, and that's a pretty big number. You compare that to a day one random lynch, and now we're talking not a 70-30 lynch, but a 50-50 lynch just at that one moment. And just by randomly taking someone out of the game, it only reduces the win percentage to 41.9. Well, this is clear evidence that it's better to kill someone than to allow sleep. And so, failing to get a lynch on the guaranteed on day one is a really dangerous play for town to make. They should never get to the RNG formals at that point and should attempt to get someone out of the game. And of course, you always feel sorry for someone who gets snap formaled at that point, but it's in town's best interest to get a player down and to essentially drain the pool a little bit so you can see the Mafia better, because that's what's happening. We can calculate the same thing for day two. You can see in the model here, you just allow day two to go from one to the other. Now, in this one, it's clear on the left side, we only have 2 Mafia left, and so we only lose 1 town member at night for sleeping. On the other side, it's just out and out disastrous. We lose another 2 town members, and it gets down to a 5 and 3. And here again, we multiply by our 7s and 3s, reduce the model so we can do all the calculations. And we end up finding that if you sleep on day 2, irrespective of what happens on any other day, it again reduces the town win percentage to the same effect that a day 1 miss lynch has. So if you think a day 1 miss lynch is bad, sleep on day 2. That one has just as big an effect on town. And what's remarkable is just randomly killing someone at that point brings your win percentage back up to 44%. And that's a huge difference. It's over a 10 percentage point difference between sleeping or randomly killing someone on that second day. And so once again, it's very, very risky for town to allow themselves to hope for an RNG formal. They're better to take care of business at the guarantee and, just feel sorry for the person who goes if it's a miss lynch. But, just shows you the power of that random lynch and what it can do to the town's win percentage.